I have stood in stillness for 19 years, and in all that time I learned that the hardest thing a man can be ordered to do is nothing. So when the hand closed around the boy's arm, I did not think. There was no thought left in me to think. There was only the long discipline of those years arriving all at once, the way a river arrives at a wall it has worn down for a lifetime. And then my own gloved hand was around the man's wrist, and the great banquet hall of Harrowgate Palace had gone as silent as a sealed tomb. But I am ahead of myself, and a story told out of order is a story half lost. Let me set you in that hall properly, because the silence that fell that night only means something if you first understand the noise. My name is Corporal Edrin Vale of the Household Foot, the standing guard of the royal house of Harrowgate. And on the evening this happened I was posted 3 paces behind the chair of His Highness Prince Joran, who was then 10 years old and trying very hard to sit as straight as a grown man at a table built for grown men. It was the Feast of the Long Accord, the oldest banquet the Kingdom of Eldermoor keeps, held each year in the State Hall under the painted ceiling, where the founders of the realm ride forever across a sky of gold leaf. 200 candles stood in the iron trees that lined that hall. 400 more burned in the chandeliers above. The light came down warm and shifting on the white linen, on the crystal, on the long row of faces, and a man could stand in it for hours and feel the warmth and never once be allowed to turn his head toward it. That is the post. You stand. You do not speak. You do not eat. You do not shift your weight more than the slow change a body must make to keep from fainting. You do not let your eyes follow the trays of glazed fowl and silver bowls of fruit that pass within a hand's breadth of your face. You are not a guest. You are not, in the eyes of most of the room, even a man. You are a fixture, like the iron trees and the painted ceiling, and the great trick of the work, the thing they cannot teach you, the thing you must find in yourself over years, is to be a fixture without ever for one instant ceasing to be a watcher. Because that is the secret no guest at that table ever guessed. While they ate and laughed and let the wine make them loud, while they leaned across to murmur the small cruelties that fine people murmur at feasts, every one of them passed under the eyes of men who saw everything and showed nothing. I knew before the soup was cleared which of the lords had drunk too deep, and which lady had come to the feast already weeping behind her powder. I knew which men hated the man beside them and were forced to smile across the candlelight all the same. I knew, 3 places down from the prince, that a guest I had never seen before was a danger long before he proved it. I want to be honest about that, because it matters to all that came after. I felt the wrongness of him the way you feel a draft in a sealed room, and I could do nothing about a feeling, and so I watched, and I waited, and I prayed I was wrong. His name, I would learn that night, was Lord Casimir Dunhallow, and he had come to the Feast of the Long Accord as the guest of a guest, which is the lowest way a man can arrive at a queen's table, and the way most likely to make a small man feel he has been slighted. He was perhaps 50, broad through the chest, with rings on 4 fingers of each hand and a velvet jacket the deep purple of a fresh bruise. He had the loud, easy laugh of a man who has spent his whole life being agreed with, and the eyes, I marked the eyes at once, of a man who measures every person he meets by what they can give him, and discards them the instant the sum comes up short. I tell you what I saw, not what I heard later. I saw him arrive late, after the queen had already taken her seat, which is a thing that simply is not done, and I saw him show no shame at it. I saw him take the hand of the lady who had brought him and hold it a beat too long while his eyes went past her shoulder to count the rank of the room. I saw him sit and look at the gold plate before him and look at the queen at the head of the table far above him, and I saw the small twist come to his mouth when he understood how far below her he had been placed. From that moment he drank, not as a thirsty man drinks, but as an angry one steadily, with his eyes moving, gathering some private grievance to himself, the way a fire gathers under a banked log. The Queen of Eldermoor is named Saraland, and she has held the throne for 16 years, and I will say only this of her here, because more will come. She is the reason men like me give our lives to this work and count it a fair trade. She is warm where the work is cold. She remembers the names of the undercooks. She had, that very evening, walked the length of the kitchens before the feast to thank each soul who had labored over it, which no queen before her had ever troubled to do. Beside her sat the prince consort, Lord Aldrich, a quiet man with a soldier's hands and a scholar's stillness, and at the queen's other side, lifted on cushions so she could reach her plate, sat the little Princess Malin, who was 8, and who had spent the first hour of the feast trying to feed candied plums to the carved lion on the arm of her chair. And down the table, in the place of honor for the heir though still far from his mother, sat Prince Joran, 10 years old. Dark-haired like his father, with his mother's quick eyes, dressed that night in a coat of deep green with the Harrowgate stag worked in silver thread across the breast. He was old enough to know the weight of the evening and young enough to be bored half to tears by it, and he kept glancing back over his shoulder at me, only the smallest flick of his eyes, so quick that no one at the table marked it, as if to share the joke of how very long and very dull a grown people's feast can be. I was not permitted to smile at him. So I did the thing I had learned to do over many such evenings, the thing that lives in the space the rules cannot reach. I let my eyes rest on him for the half-second of his glance, and I let him see in them that I had seen him, that I was there, that whatever else the long night held, the tall, silent man behind his chair was awake and would stay awake, and the boy turned back to his plate with the small private smile of a child who has been answered. That is the whole of it, the thing the rules forbid and the work requires. You are a fixture, and you are a watcher, and somewhere underneath both, where no order can reach and no protocol can forbid, you are a man with a man's heart, and the heart does not stop beating because a uniform is buttoned over it. It was nearly the third course when Lord Casimir Dunhallow began to speak too loudly, and the long night turned, and everything I had been trained for over 19 years came due at once. It began, as these things so often do, with a small thing made large by the wrong man holding it. A footman, carrying the great silver charger of roasted pheasant down the length of the table, came to Lord Casimir's place, and offered it as he had offered it to every guest before, with a slight bow, and the dish tilted toward the seated man so he might take what he wished. The footman was young Thomas. I knew him, a careful boy from the river country who had served barely a season, and was so anxious to do well that he trembled at the great occasions. And whether it was the trembling, or the press of the table, or simply that ill luck that follows a man when a worse man is looking for a reason, a thin runnel of the dark pan sauce slid from the lip of the charger and fell, a single dark line, across the cuff of Lord Casimir's purple velvet sleeve. It was nothing, a drop, a thing a gracious man would not have noticed, and a kind man would have waved away with a smile to spare the boy. But Lord Casimir Dunhallow had spent 2 hours drinking down a grievance, and here at last was a thing small enough to be safe to be angry about, and he seized on it the way a starving man seizes bread. "You clumsy little wretch," he said, and he said it loudly, far more loudly than the small accident warranted, loudly enough that the laughter and talk for 10 places around him faltered and died. He stood half out of his chair. He had the boy Thomas by the front of his livery now, the silver charger tilting in the footman's free hand, the pheasant sliding toward the floor. "Do you know whose coat this is? Do you know what this cost? They let river mud serve at a queen's table now, do they?" I watched it from my post. I did not move, because nothing yet required me to move, and a guard who moves at every loud voice is a guard who is of no use when the voice becomes a hand. But I watched, and I felt the cold thing in my chest that I had felt when the man first walked in, and I understood that it had not been a false reading. This was who he was. The drop of sauce had only let him out. Down the table near the queen, heads were turning now. The talk had spread its hush outward in a ring, the way a stone's ripple spreads on a still pond, and into that widening, quiet Lord Casimir's voice carried like a thrown thing. I saw young Thomas go white. I saw him try to set the charger down without dropping it. his hands shaking so badly now that the pheasant did slide, a wet dark mass of it onto the white linen. And at that, Lord Casimir gave a short, ugly laugh of disgust and shoved the boy backward by the chest. Not hard enough to fell him, but hard enough to make him stagger, hard enough to be a thing done in front of a queen's whole court. It was then that Prince Joran spoke. I had not expected it. I do not think anyone had. He was 10 years old and seated in a place of honor at a table where children are meant to be ornaments, silent and well-dressed, and he had been so bored an hour before that he had been counting the painted horses on the ceiling. But he had watched the whole of it, the way I had watched it, and something in the boy, something that came down to him, I think from his mother, who walks her own kitchens, would not let the moment pass. He didn't mean to, the prince said. His voice was high and clear, and it carried in the hush. It was an accident, my lord. Please don't shout at him. The whole table heard it. I saw the queen, far up at the head, turn her head sharply toward the sound of her son's voice, a flicker of something crossing her face, pride, and alarm, both at once, the way a mother feels when her child does a brave thing in a dangerous place. I saw the prince consort's hand go still on his cup. And I saw Lord Casimir Dunhallow turn, slowly, the ugliness still hot in his face, to see who had dared to correct him at his moment of grievance, and find that it was a boy. A child of 10 in a green coat, looking up at him with his mother's quick eyes and not a trace of fear in him yet, only the clean certainty of a child who knows a wrong from a right, and has not yet been taught that the powerful are allowed their wrongs. I have thought many times since about what crossed that man's face in that moment. I have decided that what undid him, what made what came next possible, was that he was humiliated. A footman he could shove. A footman was nothing, river mud, a thing beneath him, and shoving him cost nothing. But to be corrected publicly before the whole of the Queen's court, by a child, that was a wound to the one thing Lord Casimir truly possessed, which was the towering, brittle idea of his own importance. And a small man's importance, when it is wounded, does not look for the strong to strike at. It looks for someone smaller still. And who, said Lord Casimir, and his voice had dropped now, gone low and silken, and far more dangerous than the shouting had been. Are you, little master, to tell a lord of the realm how he may speak? He is the heir of Eldermoor, I said. I had not planned to speak. It is against everything the post requires. A guard does not address a guest unbidden, does not insert his voice into the talk of the table. But I am posted behind the prince's chair, and I am sworn to him, and there are moments when the body answers before the rule can be consulted. My voice came level and low, and it carried, because a guard learns to make a quiet voice carry, and the words fell into that ringing hush like cold water into hot oil. Lord Casimir's eyes came up to me then, away from the boy, and found the tall, red-coated figure behind the chair, and I watched him take my measure the way he took the measure of everyone. What is this thing? What can it do to me? What is it worth? And I watched him decide that I was nothing. A toy soldier. A liveried statue in a tall fur hat, forbidden by ancient rule from so much as turning my head. He had heard, no doubt, the famous discipline of the household foot. He had heard that we do not move, do not react, that men have flicked our ears and waved their hands an inch from our eyes, and we have not so much as blinked. He had heard all of it, and like every arrogant man who ever stood before a wall he did not understand, he heard it as weakness. It speaks, he said, and a few of the worst souls near him laughed, the nervous, ugly laugh of people who are afraid and choose the safety of the loud man's side. How charming! They've trained it to bark. He turned back to the prince, dismissing me entirely, and I saw his hand begin to rise, and I felt the whole long night gather to its point. I want to be exact about what happened, because everything that came after, the stillness of that hall, the things the Queen said, the slow unmaking of Lord Casimir Dunhallow before the whole court, all of it turns on a handful of seconds, and if I blur them I do the truth a disservice. The prince did not flinch. That is the first thing he should have. A grown man, red-faced and furious, was leaning down toward him over the candlelight, and any sensible child would have shrunk back. But Joran of Harrowgate sat up straighter, his small jaw set, and said, "You shouldn't have pushed him. He's allowed to make a mistake. Everyone is." It was the kindest, bravest thing, and it was exactly the wrong thing to say to a man like that, because a man like that cannot bear to be instructed in kindness by a child. I saw Lord Casmer's face go from red to that particular bloodless white of true rage, the color a face takes when the anger has gone past heat and into something colder, and I saw his rising hand stop being a gesture and become an intention. "Let me show you," he said very softly, "what happens to little boys who do not know their place." And he reached across the corner of the table, fast, far faster than a man his size and his cup should have moved, and his ringed hand closed hard around the upper arm of the prince, around the slender arm of a 10-year-old boy in a green coat, and he wrenched, dragging Joran half up out of his chair, the boy's eyes going wide now, the bravery breaking at last into the simple animal fear of a child seized by a furious adult, and a small sharp sound came out of him that was not quite a cry. "I have told you that I did not think. That is true, and it is also the only true way to describe 19 years of training. A man cannot think his way through the half-second that the work demands. If you must decide, you are already too late. The training is for exactly this, so that when the half-second comes, the body already knows, and the long discipline that has held you motionless for 10,000 hours unspools all at once into a single, exact, controlled motion." I crossed the space behind the prince's chair before the boy's small sound had finished leaving him. I did not draw the ceremonial rifle from my shoulder. There was no need of it, and a weapon at a banquet table near a child is a thing that can never be undone. I did not strike Lord Casmer. A blow is the answer of a man who has lost control, and the whole of my power that night, the whole of the lesson the court would carry away, was that I had not lost control of anything, least of all myself. What I did was simpler, and harder, and 1,000 times more total than a blow. I took his wrist. My white-gloved hand closed around the wrist of the hand that gripped the prince, not the forearm, not the sleeve, the wrist itself, the small architecture of bone and tendon there that every guardsman is taught because it is the place where a strong man's strength can be made to mean nothing. And I locked it, and I turned, the smallest part of a turn, the kind of motion that looks from across a room like almost nothing at all and feels in the joint like the closing of a door of iron. His hand opened. It had no choice. The body, when the wrist is held just so, does not consult the man's pride or his rage. It simply lets go, because to do otherwise is to break, and I had given him, in that controlled and measured pressure, the one mercy he had not earned, which was the choice not to break. His fingers sprang from the prince's arm as if the boy had become a coal. And Joran dropped back into his chair, gasping, unhurt. I knew he was unhurt. I had felt the geometry of it. The man's grip released before the wrench could become a true harm, and I held Lord Casmer Dunhallow's wrist in my white glove, and I did not let go, and I looked at him. That is when the hall went silent. I have stood in that state hall for many feasts, and I have heard it loud, and I have heard it murmur, but I had never in 19 years heard it as silent as it went in the seconds after I took that man's wrist. The talk did not fade. It stopped, all at once, 200 people drawing the same breath together and holding it. A goblet, knocked by someone half risen, went over and rolled and fell from the table's edge and shattered on the marble, and in that silence it was as loud as a falling bell, and not one head turned toward it. Every eye in the hall was on the corner of the table where a tall red-coated guard held a velvet-sleeved lord by the wrist, and the lord's arm was bent at an angle his face had not yet caught up to, and between them sat a small boy in a green coat, rubbing his arm, looking up. I did not raise my voice. The whole length of the hall could hear me, because the hall had made itself silent to hear, and into that silence I said the only words I said in that moment, and I said them low and level and without heat. You will take your hand from the Prince of Eldermoor, and you will sit down, and you will be still." His hand was already gone from the prince. He understood that I meant the rest. But a man like Lord Casimir Dunhallow does not surrender in front of a watching court without one last grasp at the dignity he imagines is his. And so, even with his wrist locked in my glove and the joint singing its quiet warning up his arm, he found it in himself to sneer. "Do you have any idea," he hissed low for me alone, though the silence carried it further than he knew, "who I am? Take your hand off me, you painted clown, or I will see you flogged and turned out into the street by morning. I will have your name. I will have your post. I will have—" "You will have nothing," I said. And I looked past him, down the long table, to the head of it, where the Queen of Eldermoor had risen from her chair. She had risen without haste. That was the thing I marked even in that moment, even with the man's wrist in my hand and my whole attention split between him and the boy. The Queen did not surge up in alarm. She rose the way a tide rises, slow and total and impossible to argue with, and she set down her napkin beside her plate with a deliberate care that was somehow more terrible than any shout could have been. The whole hall, which had been frozen on the corner of the table, turned now as one toward the head of it, and the silence that had been astonished became a silence that was afraid. But I am ahead of the night again. Let me hold there. Let me hold the Queen on her feet at the head of the table, and the Lord's wrist in my glove and the boy gasping in his chair. And let me tell you the rest in its order, because what came after did not happen in an instant. The seizing of the prince took seconds. The unmaking of Lord Casimir Dunhallow took the rest of the night, and some of it took years, and to understand why the court spoke of it for a generation you must understand it slowly, the way they lived it. So I will let go of his wrist for a moment, in the telling, and tell you first who I am, and how a man comes to stand for 19 years behind the chairs of children, and why the stillness that the Lord mistook for weakness is the strongest thing I know. I came to the household foot at 19 myself, which means I have now stood the post for as long as I had lived before I took it. My father was a farrier in the hill country to the north, where the wind comes off the high moor, and a man learns young that the world does not care whether he is tired. I was the third of 6 and the largest, and there was no land for me and no trade my father could spare to teach me. And so, when the recruiters of the household came through our market town in the spring of my 19th year, taking the tall and the steady for the Queen standing guard, I went with them, and I have never once regretted it, and I have many times nearly died of how hard it is. People think the hardest part of the post is the standing. It is not. A young man's legs ache for the first season and then they learn, and after that the body holds itself almost without asking. The hardest part of the post is the not reacting, and the hardest part of the not reacting is that you must do it while seeing everything. Anyone can be a statue if a statue is also blind and deaf, but we are not permitted to be blind or deaf. We are required to see the whole hall, to mark every face, to know in our bones the difference between a guest reaching for the salt and a guest reaching for something he should not, and to give no sign, none, that we have seen any of it, until the instant the seeing must become doing. To hold all of that awareness behind a face of stone, hour upon hour, feast upon feast, year upon year, that is the work, and it breaks more men than the standing ever did. I have seen tall, strong lads who could have carried an ox come to the household foot and fail inside a month, not because their legs gave out, but because they could not bear it, could not bear to see a wrong done a yard from their face and make no sign, could not bear the contempt of the guests who flicked at us and laughed, could not bear the long erasure of being treated as furniture by people they could have lifted with one hand. The work is not for the strong. The work is for the disciplined, which is a different and rarer thing, and the difference between them is precisely the difference that Lord Casimir Dunhallow had failed fatally to understand when he looked at me and saw a clown in a fur hat. For here is the truth of it, the truth at the center of everything I am about to tell you. A strong man who cannot govern his strength is the most useless thing at a queen's table. He is a danger to everyone, the very guest he is meant to guard against. The man you want at your child's back is not the man who can strike the hardest. It is the man who has spent 19 years learning, against every instinct in his blood, exactly when not to strike, and who therefore knows in the 1/2 second when striking is wrong and a held wrist is right, precisely which to choose. The whole of my power that night was restraint, not the absence of force, the mastery of it. I could have broken Lord Casimir's arm in the time it took him to gasp. That would have been the weak thing, the easy thing, the thing his own kind of strength would have reached for. Instead, I held it at the exact threshold where his hand must open and his bone need not break. And I held it there steady, for as long as the moment required. And that holding, that exactness, that refusal to do one grain more harm than the protecting of the boy demanded, is the thing the whole court would remember, and the thing his shouting could never touch. But I run ahead once more. The queen was on her feet. Let me bring you back to the hall. Corporal Vale, the queen said. She had not raised her voice. She did not need to. The hall was so silent now that her words walked its whole length on their own. But it stopped my breath all the same, because in 19 years the queen had never once spoken my name aloud at a feast, and the fact that she knew it, that she had it ready on her tongue in that instant, the name of the man who stood behind her son's chair, told the whole watching court, that the Queen of Eldermoor knew exactly who was who in her own hall, down to the corporal of the foot. Majesty, I answered, and did not let go of the wrist. Is my son hurt? No, Majesty. I had felt it, as I have told you, in the geometry of the grip. I had broken the wrench before it could become a true harm. But a queen does not take a guard's word on her child, and so I looked down at the boy, who was looking up at me with his arm cradled against his chest and his eyes very wide, and I said low only to him, "Your Highness, move your fingers for me." He moved them, all 5 then again, the small green-coated arm working as it should. The relief that went through me was a private thing, and I did not show it, but I said, for the queen and the hall to hear, "He is unhurt, Majesty, frightened, not harmed." And then a strange thing happened, the first of the night's strange mercies. The boy, the prince, 10 years old and seized and shaken in front of 200 staring strangers, did not weep. He drew a breath that shook, and he sat up straight in his chair, and he looked at the man who had grabbed him, looked at Lord Casimir Dunhallow with my glove still locked on his wrist, and the prince said, in a voice that wobbled and held, "It's all right, Corporal Vale. You can let him go now. He's sorry." He was not sorry. Everyone in the hall knew he was not sorry. Lord Casimir's face was a study in everything but sorrow. But the prince, even shaken, even afraid, had reached for the most graceful exit the moment allowed, had tried to hand even this man a path back to dignity. And in doing so he had shown the whole court, more plainly than any speech, the difference between the child of Harrowgate and the lord who had laid hands on him. I have heard it said since that the boy won the room in that one sentence, and I believe it. A child of 10, offered cruelty, had answered with grace. The court did not forget it. But the matter was not mine to settle on a prince's word, kind as the word was. I looked again to the head of the table, to the queen, for she alone could tell me what the moment now required, and she met my eyes the length of that long hall, and she gave me the smallest nod. "You may release him, corporal," she said. "He will not reach for my son again." And then, to the hall, in a voice gone cold and clear as the crystal on the cloth, "He will not reach for anything in this hall again." I opened my glove. Lord Casimir Dunhallow snatched his wrist back to his chest, cradling it as the prince had cradled his arm, and for a moment the two of them sat there mirrored, the grown man and the boy, each holding the place where the other's grip had been. And the difference between them in that mirroring was the whole of the matter, and not a soul in the hall could fail to see it. For an instant I thought it might end there. I thought the man might have the sense, even now, even drunk and humiliated, to be still, to take the path the boy had offered him, to fold himself small and slip from the hall and let the night close over him. A wiser man would have. A wiser man would have understood that he had already lost everything that mattered, that the only choice left to him was whether to lose it quietly or loudly. Lord Casimir Dunhallow chose loudly. He surged to his feet, his chair scraping back across the marble, his face working, and he flung out his cradled arm toward me, toward the Queen, toward the whole table, and the words came pouring out of him hot and reckless, the words of a man who has felt the ground go out from under his importance and is grasping at anything, to pull it back. "This is an outrage," he said, loud, too loud, his voice cracking on it. "I am a guest at this table, a guest. I am Casimir Dunhallow of the Westmark Dunhallows, and I have been assaulted by a common soldier in front of the whole court over nothing, over a boy's insolence and a clumsy servant's mess. Is this how Eldermoor treats its guests? Is this the famous justice of the House of Harrowgate, that a lord may be manhandled by a liveried thug while the Queen looks on and nods?" He was pointing at me now, his ringed finger shaking. "I will have the law on this. I will have this man's name in every court in the realm. I have friends, Majesty, friends you would do well not to make enemies of. The Dunhallow name opens doors you cannot imagine. My cousin sits on the exchequer bench. My uncle holds the salt rights of the whole eastern shore. You think you can lay hands on me, I will ruin that creature behind your son's chair, and I will see this insult answered. Or by every god of the old realm, I will make Harrowgate regret the night it crossed Casimir Dunhallow." The hall held its breath, and the Queen of Eldermoor, who had not sat back down, looked at him for a long, long moment across the candlelight, and when she spoke at last her voice was not angry at all. It was worse than angry. It was calm. "Lord Dunhallow," she said, "you have just told this entire court in your own voice exactly the kind of man you are. I thank you for sparing me the trouble of explaining it. Now sit down. The matter is not finished, and you will want to hear how it ends." He did not sit. I think he could not. The rage had him too fully now, and rage of that kind cannot bear to be told to sit any more than a fire can be told to lie still. He stood there shaking, his ruined dignity a worse wound to him than any blow could have been, and into that dangerous pause the great doors at the end of the State Hall opened, and Captain Halrick of the household foot came in. I had not seen who sent for him. It would have been the steward, most likely, or one of the under-officers posted at the doors, for word travels through a guarded house faster than any runner can carry it, and the alarm of a hand laid on the air would have gone out the instant my glove closed on the wrist. However it came, the captain came, and the sight of him changed the temperature of the hall. Captain Halrick was 60 that year, and he had stood the post himself for 40 of those years before they raised him to command, and there was not a man or woman in the realm who had served the household who did not go a little straighter when he entered a room. He was not large. That always surprised people who had heard of him. He was lean and gray and walked with the slight stiffness of a man whose body has paid the price of a lifetime of standing, and his face was the most still face I have ever known, stiller even than the mask we all wear on the post, because in his, the stillness had gone all the way down and become the man. He crossed the length of the hall without haste, his boots loud in the silence, and he came to a halt 3 paces from Lord Casimir Dunhallow, and he looked at him. That was all, he looked at him, and Lord Casimir, who had shouted down a queen, fell silent. "You are Lord Casimir Dunhallow," the captain said. It was not a question. Yes, I am, and I demand." "You laid hands upon the person of the heir of Eldermoor," the captain said, in the same flat, unhurried voice as though he were reading from a ledger. "Before the Queen, before the court, at the feast of the long accord. He let each clause fall and settle. Do you understand, Lord Dunhallow, what you have done? The boy insulted me. The servant, there was a mess. I was provoked." "You were provoked," the captain repeated, and for the first time something moved beneath the stillness of his face, something that was not quite contempt and not quite pity but lived in the country between them. By a child of 10 asking you to be kind to a frightened servant. Yes, I see how a man might be provoked beyond bearing by such a thing. And the dry, terrible mildness of it was worse than any rebuke, and Lord Casimir flushed dark and could not answer it. The captain turned then to me. "Corporal Vale, report." I gave it as a guard gives a report, plain and ordered, holding nothing back and adding nothing. "Lord Dunhallow struck the footman Tomas about a spilled dish, sir. His Highness Prince Joran asked him to be gentle." Lord Dunhallow took offense and seized His Highness by the upper arm and pulled him from his chair. I crossed to the prince and secured Lord Dunhallow's wrist until he released the boy. His Highness is frightened but unharmed. I confirmed the movement of his fingers. Lord Dunhallow then threatened my post, my name, and the house of Harrowgate before the court. The Queen ordered his release and I released him. The captain listened to all of it without expression, his pale eyes moving once to the prince, who sat very straight under the old soldier's glance, proud to be reported on so, and once to me, and once, last and longest, to Lord Casimir Dunhallow. "You secured his wrist," the captain said to me. "You did not strike him." "No, sir." "You did not draw your weapon." "No, sir." "You held him exactly as long as the prince required, and no longer." "Yes, sir." The captain nodded once, and there was in that single nod a thing I had earned over 19 years and would not have traded for any decoration the realm could pin to my chest, the approval of a man who knew exactly how hard the right answer had been. "Then you did your duty," he said, "and you did it as it ought to be done." He turned back to the hall and raised his voice, not much, only enough, so that the whole of it would carry his meaning into every corner. "Mark what you have seen tonight. A guard of this house was mocked as a clown and a thug by a man who laid hands on a child. And that guard answered the insult to a prince's body with the least force that would serve, and the insult to his own honor with no force at all. That is the discipline of the household foot. That is what stands between this house and the world. Remember it." And the hall, which had been silent with shock, made a new sound then, a low murmur that ran the length of the table, and I understood after a moment what it was, though I had never heard it before from the great folk at a feast. It was assent. It was the sound of 200 people, lords and ladies and dignitaries of the realm, agreeing with what the old captain had said, agreeing aloud, taking the side of the red-coated guard over the velvet-coated lord. And I confess that even with my face held to its stone, the sound of it moved something in me that I had thought long since hardened over. Lord Casimir Dunhallow heard it too, and it was then, I think, hearing the whole court turn against him in a single murmur, that the last of his bluster left him, and the first cold breath of true fear came in. "Take him out," the Queen said. She had sat down again, not in defeat, but in the manner of a sovereign who has decided a matter and need stand for it no longer. "Lord Dunhallow will be escorted from the hall and from the palace grounds, and he will be held under the king's peace until the morning, when this court will determine what is owed for a hand laid upon the heir of the realm at the Queen's own table. He is not to be harmed. He is not to be touched beyond what his leaving requires. But he is to go now, and he is to understand that he leaves not as a guest dismissed, but as a man who has answered for himself with his own mouth, and will answer for himself again before the law." 2 guardsmen of the foot came forward at the captain's signal, Brennar and young Oslo, both good steady men, and they took their places one at each of Lord Casimir's shoulders, not gripping him, only standing close, the unmistakable geometry of an escort, and the Lord looked from one to the other and then, last, to me. I will not pretend I felt nothing as he looked at me. There is a kind of man whose hatred, once earned, becomes the truest thing about him, and I saw in Lord Casimir Dunhallow's eyes that I had earned it, that he would carry me in him like a splinter for years, that he meant every word of his threat to ruin me, and would spend whatever portion of his importance survived the night in trying to make it good. A lesser fear than that has unmade better men than I. But I had stood the post for 19 years, and I had learned somewhere in those years that a man's hatred is his own burden to carry and not mine to fear. And so I met his eyes and gave him nothing, not contempt, not triumph, not even acknowledgement, only the same flat watchfulness I had given him from the first, the watchfulness that had read him true before he ever proved it, and he turned away from it as men always turn away from a wall they cannot move. They led him out. He went without further word, which surprised me. I had thought he would shout the whole length of the hall. But the murmur of the court had broken something in him, and he walked between Brennar and Oslo with his cradled wrist and his ruined dignity and his purple velvet, and the great doors closed behind the three of them, and the matter of that night at least was over. I returned to my post behind the prince's chair. That is the part no one tells in the stories that get told of such nights afterward. They tell of the grab and the block and the queen rising and the lord led out. They do not tell that the guard then simply goes back to standing. But that is the truth of it, and it is the heart of the work. The hall did not end. The feast did not end. There were 3 more courses to come, and a queen at the head of the table and 200 guests whose evening had been shaken but not stopped. And the standing guard does not get to sit down because his heart is still hammering, and his hands, inside the white gloves, have begun at last to shake now that there is nothing left for them to do. He goes back to his post. He holds his face to its stone, and he stands. So I stood, and behind the boy's chair in the warm shifting candlelight with the talk of the hall slowly, carefully, beginning to rise again around me, I stood, and I let the afterstorm of it pass through me where no one could see. For it does pass through you. That is the cost the stories never count. You hold yourself to stillness through the thing itself, because the work requires it and the half-second allows nothing else, and then the thing is over and you must go on standing, and only then, when it is too late to be of any use, does the body try to give you back all the fear it would not let you feel. My heart was going like a hammer on an anvil. My breath wanted to come fast, and I would not let it. And underneath both of those, deeper down, there was a thing I had to govern more carefully than either, because it was the most dangerous thing a guard can feel on his post, and it was rage. I had wanted, in the instant his hand closed on the boy, to break his arm. I will not lie to you about that. A man who tells you he felt nothing but cold duty in such a moment is either a liar or has no business near a child. The thing that came up in me when I saw the prince wrenched from his chair was older than discipline and far stronger, and it wanted to do far more than hold a wrist. It wanted to make sure the hand that had done it would never do it again to anyone. And the whole of my 19 years, the whole of the work, the whole of what the captain had praised, was the governing of exactly that, the holding of that ancient roaring thing on its leash through the very seconds it most strained to be free, so that what reached Lord Casimir Dunhallow was not my rage but my judgment, not the force I wanted to use but the force the moment required. That is the secret of restraint that the arrogant never understand. They think the still man feels nothing. They could not be more wrong. The still man feels everything, feels it harder, I sometimes think, than the men who let it out, and the stillness is not the absence of the storm but the mastery of it, the daily, hourly, lifelong labor of being a man with a man's full heart, and giving the world only what the world has a right to. Lord Casimir had looked at me and seen an empty suit of red wool. He had not understood that he was standing in front of a banked fire, and that the only reason it did not burn him to the ground was that the man tending it had spent 19 years learning exactly how much to let it out. So I stood and I governed the fire, and behind the boy's chair I let the afterstorm pass, and slowly it passed, and the hall came back to its warmth and its noise, and the long feast went on. But the night was far from finished, for the matter of Lord Casimir Dunhallow had only seemed to end when the doors closed behind him. In truth, it had barely begun. The first sign of how far it would reach came not from the lord but from the boy. Prince Joran sat very quietly through the courses that followed. Too quietly. I knew the difference, posted as close as I was, between a child's natural quiet and the quiet of a child who is holding something in. He ate little. He did not glance back at me over his shoulder as he had before, with the small shared joke of the board. He kept his arm, the arm that had been seized, tucked close against his side, and now and then I saw his free hand creep across to touch it, to press the place where the ringed fingers had been, not because it hurt, for I had spared him hurt, but because the body remembers a fright even when the flesh is sound. It was perhaps an hour later, when the sweets had been brought, and the formal part of the feast had loosened into the wandering talk that ends such evenings, that the boy at last turned in his chair and looked up at me. The candlelight was low and gold by then. His mother's quick eyes were dark and serious in his small face. "Corporal Vale," he said low so that only I could hear, "how did you do that with his hand? He's so much bigger than me, and you made him let go like he was nothing." I am not, by the rule, to speak with the prince at length on my post, but I have told you already that there are moments the rule does not reach, and a frightened child asking how he was saved is one of them. So I answered him low, my eyes still moving over the hall as they must. "It is not size, your highness," I said. "A small thing held in the right place can master a large one. The wrist is such a place. I did not need to be stronger than he was. I needed only to know where his strength could be made to mean nothing." I paused, and then I said the thing I most wanted him to carry away from the night, the thing that mattered more than the trick of the wrist. "But the holding of it is not the hard part. The hard part is letting go at the right moment and not one moment late. Anyone can take hold. It takes years to learn when to release. That is the whole of it, your highness. The strength is in the restraint." He thought about that the way a thoughtful child thinks, turning it over. "You wanted to hurt him," he said then, not as an accusation but as a child sees a true thing and says it plainly. "I saw your face just for a second. You wanted to." I will not forget that. A boy of 10 had seen, in the half-second before the stone mask came down, the thing I had governed so carefully that I had thought no one could see it. The young see more than we credit them. And I would not lie to him, for a lie told to a child is the worst kind, the kind that teaches him not to trust his own true sight. "Yes," I said, "I did. He had laid hands on you, and there is a thing in a man, your highness, that rises up when the helpless are harmed, and it wants to answer harm with harm. I felt it. I will not tell you I did not. I let my eyes come down to him just for a breath. But a man who lets that thing rule him is no use to you, your highness. He is only another danger in the room. The whole of my service to you is that I feel it, and I do not let it rule me. I gave that man exactly what was needed to free you, and nothing more, because the nothing more is what tells you I am yours and not my own angers. Do you understand?" He nodded slowly. And then, in the way of children, he reached the bottom of a fear by walking straight into it, and he said he'd ruin you. He said he had friends and his cousin's a judge, and he'd have your name and your post. Will they take you away because you saved me?" And there it was, the thing I had not let myself look at directly, said aloud by a boy in the warm gold light of the dying feast. "Will he ruin you?" I had given the matter no place in my mind during the thing itself, because a guard cannot weigh the cost to himself in the half-second the work demands. If he does, he hesitates, and the hesitation is the harm. But the feast was over now, the half-second long past, and the question had teeth, and the boy had asked it, and I owed him an honest answer to that too. "I do not know, your highness," I said. "Men with friends can do a great deal of harm with them. It is possible he will try, and possible he will find ears that listen. I will not pretend to you that a corporal of the foot is safe from the anger of a lord." I saw the boy's face fall, and I went on, because the truth was not finished, and the second half of it mattered more than the first. "But I will tell you this. If standing between you and a man who would harm you costs me my post, then my post was never worth keeping. I did not take the risk to keep my place, your highness. I took it to keep you. Whatever it costs me, it was the right thing, and a man who will not do the right thing for fear of the cost is not a guard. He is only a coat on a peg. I would do it again tonight if he reached for you again this minute. So do not carry my trouble for me. I'm a grown man, and I chose it with my eyes open, and the choosing was easy. Carry only this, that you are safe, and that you were brave, and that what you did for the footman, asking a cruel man to be kind, was the finest thing done in this hall tonight, finer than anything I did. You hear me?" The boy's eyes were bright. He nodded hard and turned back to face the table and sat up very straight, and I saw him square his small shoulders under the silver stag, and I thought, there is a king in there some day, not because of his blood, because of what rose up in him when a servant was shoved, and because of what he chose to do with the fear of a man twice his size. It was a fine moment, the finest of a hard night, and I should have known the world would not let it stand. For even as the boy squared his shoulders, the great doors at the end of the hall opened a second time, and the steward came in with a face I knew too well, the face of a man bearing news that could not wait until morning, and he crossed to the queen and bent and murmured at her ear, and I watched the queen's face change, and I understood that Lord Casimir Dunhallow's friends had not waited for morning either. I did not learn the whole of it that night. A guard on his post hears fragments and reads faces. The full shape of a thing comes to him later, in pieces, from the talk of the household and the things great folk forget that servants and guards can hear. But I will give it to you here whole, as I came to know it, so that you understand what was set in motion that night while the candles burned down in the State Hall. Lord Casimir Dunhallow had told the truth about one thing, and one thing only. He did have friends. The Dunhallows of the Westmark were an old family, not so high as they believed themselves, but high enough to have married into a dozen others, and the web of cousins and uncles and debts and favors that a family weaves over generations was, in their case, real and wide, and the kind of thing that can reach a long way into the workings of a realm. The cousin on the exchequer bench was real. The uncle with the salt rights of the eastern shore was real. And there was more that Lord Casimir had not even troubled to boast of, because he had not thought he would need it. A brother-in-law who sat in the Queen's own privy council, a man named Lord Erskine Vaught, the controller of the household, who held among his many offices the authority over the very budgets and appointments of the standing guard. The controller of the household, the man who held the purse and the rolls of the foot, the man who could, with a stroke of a pen and a word in the right ear, see a corporal reassigned to the coldest, meanest post in the realm, or stripped of his place entirely, or worse, investigated, charged, made an example of, his name blackened in the careful, deniable way that powerful men blacken the names of those beneath them. And it was Lord Erskine Vaught who had sent the message that the steward now murmured at the Queen's ear, not an hour after his brother-in-law had been led from the hall. The message was a velvet glove over an iron demand. Lord Vaught had heard with the gravest concern of an unfortunate incident at the feast. He understood that a guard, no doubt acting in a moment of confusion, had assaulted a distinguished guest of the crown. He was certain the Queen would wish the matter handled discreetly, before it became a scandal that touched the dignity of the house itself. He proposed that the guard in question, one Corporal Vale, he believed, be suspended from his duties at once, pending a full inquiry, and that Lord Dunhallow be released from custody immediately with the Crown's apologies, so that an ugly misunderstanding need not poison the goodwill the realm depended upon. He was confident, Lord Vaught's message said, that Her Majesty would see the wisdom of this. He looked forward to discussing the particulars in the morning. It was, I understood when I came to know it, a masterwork of its kind. It did not threaten. It did not bluster as Casimir had blustered. Erskine Vaught was a far more dangerous man than his brother-in-law precisely because he never raised his voice. It simply laid out in the language of reasonableness and discretion the path the Queen was expected to take, the easy path, the quiet path, the path that traded one corporal of the foot for peace with a powerful family and an end to an embarrassing night. Suspend the guard, release the lord, Let it all go away. Who, after all, was a corporal weighed against the goodwill of the Privy Council's controller? Who was a liveried statue weighed against a scandal? This was the false dawn in reverse, though I did not see it so at the time. It was the moment when the reasonable, the discreet, the sensible middle course was laid before the Queen like a smooth road, and the smooth road led directly over me, and over the truth of what had happened in the hall, and over the boy's faith that the man who saved him would not be punished for it. It would have been so easy to take. Most thrones would have taken it. A corporal is cheap. The goodwill of the controller of the household is not. I saw none of the message's words that night. I saw only the Queen's face as she read them in the steward's murmur, and I saw it go still, not soft still as it usually was, but hard still, the stillness of a woman who has just been handed a test and knows it for a test. She read it, and she sat with it a moment, and then she did a thing that I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count. She looked down the length of the table, past the lords and the ladies, past the dignitaries and the empty place where Lord Casimir had sat, all the way down to the corner where her son sat squaring his small shoulders, and to the tall red-coated figure standing behind his chair. She looked at me. The whole hall did not see it. It was the briefest glance, the kind a queen learns to give without anyone marking it. But I saw it, and I understood that I was being weighed, not by Lord Vaught's scale but by hers, and I did not know yet which way the scale would tip, and I will tell you honestly that for the space of that glance my heart, which had only just stopped hammering from the grab, began to hammer again, because a man can stand unafraid before a lord's rage and still be afraid of losing the only work he has ever been proud of. Then the Queen turned to the steward and gave him an answer, quiet, 3 or 4 words, and the steward straightened and bowed and went out, and I did not hear what she had said. I would not learn it until the morning. And the not knowing of it, through that long last hour of the feast and the longer night that followed, was its own kind of trial, to stand my post, to keep my face to its stone, to do the work as though nothing in the world had changed, while somewhere in the palace the question of whether I would still have a post by sunrise was being decided by people who had never once asked my name. The feast ended at last. The guests rose and made their bows and went out into the cold spring night, and the candles guttered in the iron trees, and the footmen began the long work of clearing the great hall. The royal family withdrew. The Queen passed close by me as she left, the little Princess Malin half asleep on the Prince Consort's shoulder, and Prince Joran walking very upright at his mother's side. And as they passed, the boy turned his head and found my eyes and gave me, instead of the small shared joke of the bored child, a different look entirely, a grave, steady look, the look of a boy who had decided to be a man about a hard thing. And I gave him the only answer my post allowed, which was to be there, unmoved. Exactly where he had last seen me, the fixed point in his frightening night. When the family had gone, the captain came to me where I stood, and he said, "Lo, you are relieved, corporal. Walk with me." We walked the cold stone corridors of the palace, the captain and I, our boots loud in the emptied night, past the tapestries gone gray in the dark and the suits of old armor standing their own eternal posts, and for a long while the captain said nothing, and I knew better than to fill his silence. At last, when we had come to the long gallery above the forecourt where a man could look down through the tall windows at the lamps and the gates, he stopped, and he turned to me. "You know what has been asked of the Queen tonight," he said. It was not quite a question. The captain always knew what was moving in the house. "I know that the controller of the household is Lord Dunhillow's brother-in-law," I said, "and that the steward came twice with messages. I do not know what was in them." "What was in them," the captain said, "was the price of you. Lord Vaught has asked the Queen to suspend you from your duties and to release his brother-in-law with the Crown's apology. He has framed it as discretion. It is a purchase. He is buying the night back, and the coin he proposes to pay with is your name." I had known it more or less from the Queen's face, but to hear it said plainly, in the captain's flat gray voice, in the cold gallery in the dead of the night, was a different thing, and I felt it go into me like the spring chill through the tall windows. My name. 19 years of it, the only thing I had ever made that I was proud of, offered up as the price of a powerful man's comfort. "And what has the Queen answered?" I asked. "I do not know," the captain said. "She has not told me. She has told no one. She has gone to her rooms to think, which is more than most thrones would do. Most thrones would have paid the price without thinking because the price is cheap." He looked at me a long moment with those pale, still eyes. "I will tell you what I told her when she asked my counsel. Do you wish to hear it?" "Yes, sir." "I told her," the captain said, "that the discipline of the household foot is not a thing she can spend. That the day a guard learns his honor will be sold to buy peace with a powerful man is the day the household foot becomes a troupe of actors in red coats, and the Queen had better not rely on actors to stand between her children and the world. I told her that you did the work exactly as it ought to be done, with the least force that would serve, and that if doing the work perfectly is to be punished to soothe the family of the man who laid hands on her son, then she will have taught every guard in her service that the safe thing is to do nothing, to stand still, and let the boy be dragged from his chair, because the man doing the dragging has a brother-in-law on the council. I told her that a guard who has learned that lesson is worse than no guard at all." He paused, and I told her that the choice was hers as it must be, for she is the Queen and I am only an old man who stands at doors. But that if she sold you, she should know exactly what she was buying, and what she was selling, and that the second was worth a great deal more than the first. I could not speak for a moment. It is a strange thing to hear a man you have served under for years, a man so sparing of words that a full sentence from him is an event, lay down your worth in front of a queen as though it were a matter of plain fact. I had not known, until that cold gallery, what the captain thought of me. The post does not allow for the telling of such things. We had stood 10,000 hours in the same silence and never once spoken of what we were to each other, and now in the dead of night, with my name on the scales, he had told me. "Thank you, sir," I managed. "Do not thank me yet," the captain said. I gave her my counsel. The choosing is hers, and she is a queen, and queens have many things to weigh that an old guard does not see. It is possible she will choose the smooth road. Most would. If she does, and here something came into his face that I had never seen there, a kind of hardness that was almost grief. If she does, corporal, you will take it like a guard. You will not shout, you will not curse her, you will not let one soul see that it broke you. You will hand over your coat with your back straight, and you will walk out of this palace exactly as you walked in, and you will let no man say that a corporal of the foot whined when the world used him ill. Do you understand me? The last and hardest discipline of this work is to bear injustice with honor. I pray you are not asked to, but if you are, you will bear it as you bore the rest. That too is the post. "Yes, sir," I said, and I meant it, though it cost me more to mean it than anything had cost me in the hall. The captain left me then, and I stood a while longer in the cold gallery looking down at the lamps of the forecourt, and I let myself think, for the first time in many years, about why the work had come to mean what it meant to me. I told you that I came to it as a farrier's third son with no land and no trade, and that is true, but it is not the whole of why I stayed. A man does not give 19 years to standing still for the wages alone. The wages of the foot are honest, but they are not large. I stayed because of a thing that happened in my second year, when I was 20 and still half a boy myself, and it is a thing I have told almost no one, and I will tell you now because it is the root of everything else. In my second year there was an old guardsman named Cale who was near the end of his service, a man who had stood the post for 40 years as the captain would later do, and who took it upon himself, as the old sometimes do with the young, to teach me what could not be put in the drill manual. And one winter night I was on the gate, half frozen, miserable, certain that I had thrown my life away on a fool's work of standing in the cold for people who looked through me as though I were glass. Old Cale stood his relief beside me and said, without my asking, "You think they don't see you, the great folk. You think you're furniture to them, and tonight you hate it, I can tell." I said nothing, because he was right and I was ashamed of it. "Here is what no one tells the young," Kale said. "You're not standing here for the great folk. You never were. The lords and ladies who look through you, they're not who the post is for. The post is for the ones who can't protect themselves. The child who wakes from a nightmare in a great cold palace and is comforted only because she knows a man she trusts is standing at her door in the dark. The old servant who can walk home through the worst part of the city because the foot patrols it. The frightened, the small, the ones the great folk look through same as they look through you. You and the ones at the bottom, you're the same people, lad. You stand here so that the powerful cannot do as they please with the powerless. That's the whole of it. That's why a farrier's son and not a lord stands this gate, because a lord's son would forget who the post is for, and you never will, because you've been on the other side of the glass. Don't you ever let them make you forget it." "I have never forgotten it." Old Kale died the spring after he said it, quietly in his bed, an honored man, and I have carried his words for 17 years, and they were never truer than on the night Lord Casimir Dunhallow seized a boy by the arm. For that was the whole of it laid bare, was it not? A powerful man doing as he pleased with a smaller one, certain that no one would stop him, certain that the red-coated statue was furniture, and the boy was his to handle, and the world was arranged for the comfort of men like himself. And the post, old Kale's post, the captain's post, my post, exists for exactly one reason, to be the place where that certainty meets a wall it did not expect. I had been the wall. That was the work. That was the only work I had ever wanted, once I understood it, and now it might be taken from me to soothe the very kind of man it existed to stop, and the wrongness of that sat in me all the cold night through. I slept little. At the gray edge of morning, before the palace had properly woken, a runner came to the barracks of the foot with word that the controller of the household, Lord Erskine Vaught, had summoned Corporal Edrin Vale to attend him in his offices at once. Not the Queen, Lord Vaught. I understood the move even as I dressed. He had not waited for the Queen to answer his message. He meant to settle the matter himself before she rose, to present her with a thing already done, the guard suspended, the apology dispatched, the night tidied away, so that she need only nod at a fait accompli rather than make a choice she might make wrongly. It is how such men work. They do not ask permission for the things they fear will be refused. They do them, and dare the powerful above them to undo them, knowing that undoing a thing is harder than preventing it, and that most thrones cannot be bothered. Lord Vaught was going to suspend me with his own authority as controller of the foot, and he was going to do it before breakfast, and there would be nothing the captain could do, and nothing I could do. And by the time the Queen had finished her morning cup, the thing would be over. I went. A guard summoned by the controller goes. There is no choice in it. But as I crossed the cold courtyard in the gray light, my breath smoking, my boots ringing on the stones I had stood over for 19 years, I made myself a promise, and it was the captain's promise, that whatever was done to me in that office, I would take it like a guard. I would not shout. I would not beg. I would not give Lord Erskine Vaught the satisfaction of seeing the man he was unmaking unmade. I would stand straight, and I would hand over whatever he demanded, and I would walk out with my back unbent, and old Kale and the captain and the boy in the green coat would have no cause to be ashamed of how I bore it. That was my plan. I am glad to tell you that it was not what happened. But I did not know that yet, climbing the cold stair to the controller's offices, and I will tell the rest as I lived it in its order, so that you feel the turn the way I felt it. The offices of the controller of the household were warm and rich and very quiet, the kind of quiet that money buys. A fire burned, though the morning was not cold enough to need one. The walls were lined with ledgers in tooled leather and portraits of dead controllers in their chains of office, and behind a great desk of dark polished wood sat Lord Erskine Vaught, writing, and he did not look up when I was shown in, and he let me stand before his desk in silence for a long while as he finished his sentence, because making a man wait is the first small cruelty of the powerful, the cheapest way to say I am above you. Your time is nothing. I stood at attention and let him. I had stood for 19 years. I could stand a little longer. At last he set down his pen and looked at me, and I took his measure as I take every man's, and I found him more dangerous than his brother-in-law by far. Where Casimir Dunhallow had been all heat and bluster, Erskine Vaught was cool and dry and precise, a long pale man with clever eyes and a thin mouth, and a way of speaking that made every word sound like a reasonable man's regret. He was the sort of man who never does an ugly thing himself. He arranges for it to be done, and then is sad about it. "Corporal Vale," he said, "thank you for coming so promptly. This is a most unfortunate business, and I am sure you are as eager as I am to see it resolved with as little harm as possible to all concerned." "Sir," I said, and nothing more. "You are aware, I think, that the gentleman you laid hands upon last night is a member of my family, my wife's brother." He let that sit. "I want you to understand that I bear you no personal ill will. None at all. I am sure that in the confusion of the moment you believed you were doing your duty. These things happen at crowded feasts. Tempers rise, a guest gestures too sharply at a child, a guard misreads it, and before anyone can think, there is an ugly scene. I have seen it many times. No one is truly to blame. It is simply unfortunate." I said nothing. I had read his game now. He was building a version of the night in which there was no villain, no man who seized a boy, no guard who saved him, only a misunderstanding, a misreading, an unfortunate scene in which everyone had meant well and no one need be punished, and therefore his brother-in-law need not answer for anything. And into that soft gray nothing, my truth, a man laid hands on the heir of the realm, and I stopped him, would simply dissolve. "Now," Lord Vaught went on in the same regretful, reasonable voice, "the difficulty is one of dignity. The dignity of the crown, you understand. If word spreads that a guest of the Queen's was assaulted at her own table, it reflects very poorly on the house, on the Queen herself. People will ask whether her household is in order, whether her guards are disciplined or wild. It does the realm no good. And so what I propose, Corporal, is a quiet resolution that protects everyone. You will be relieved of your duties, not dismissed. You understand, merely relieved, pending an inquiry that I will see is conducted with great discretion. My brother-in-law will be released this morning with a small apology, the sort of courtesy that costs nothing and soothes much, and the whole matter will simply fade. In a month no one will remember it. You will be reassigned somewhere quiet. I have some influence over postings, as you may know, and in time, when this has all been forgotten, perhaps even restored to a position of honor. I am, you see, trying to help you, Corporal. The alternative, a formal proceeding, charges of assault upon a peer of the realm, my family's considerable resources brought to bear, would not go well for you. I would spare you that. All I ask is that you accept the quiet path. Sign this acknowledgment that there was a regrettable misunderstanding, accept your relief from duty, and let us all put this behind us." He turned a paper toward me on the desk, and laid the pen upon it, and looked up at me with his clever, sad eyes, and waited. It was, I will grant him, beautifully done. There was no threat in it that a witness could have named, and no kindness in it that was real. It was the smooth road laid before my own feet now, not the Queen's. Sign this, call the truth a misunderstanding, and keep some shadow of a future. Refuse, and be ground to powder by a family with a judge and a controller and considerable resources. A wiser man for his own skin would have signed. I had a mother still living in the hill country and brothers I helped when the winters were hard, and a corporal ground to powder helps no one. Every selfish reason I had pointed at the pen. And I thought of the boy. I thought of Prince Joran turning in his chair to ask me, "Lo, will they take you away because you saved me?" and of the answer I had given him, that if standing between him and harm cost me my post was never worth keeping. I had said it to comfort a frightened child. Now here was the bill for it, laid on a polished desk, and I found this is the thing I want you to understand, the thing that surprised even me. I found that I had meant it. That it was not a brave thing said to a boy in the dark. It was simply true. To sign that paper would be to tell the boy and old Kale's ghost, and the captain and every guard who would ever stand a post after me, that the truth could be bought, that the powerful could do as they pleased with the small, that the wall would step aside if the man pushing it had a brother-in-law who held the purse. I could not do it, not because I was brave, because I could not have lived in the man who had. "No, sir," I said. Lord Vaught's clever eyes did not change, but something behind them went very cold. "I beg your pardon." "I will not sign it, sir. There was no misunderstanding." Lord Dunhallow struck a servant, and when the prince asked him to be gentle, he seized his highness by the arm and pulled him from his chair, and I stopped him with the least force that would serve and released him the instant the prince was free. That is what happened. I will say so to any inquiry, under any oath, before the Queen herself if she asks me. I will not call it a misunderstanding, because it was not one, and I will not put my name to a lie to spare your family the cost of what your brother-in-law did. You may relieve me of my duties if it is in your power. You may bring your charges and your resources, but you will not have my name on that paper, sir, and you will not have it on a lie. The fire crackled in the silence. Lord Erskine Vaught looked at me for a long moment, and the regret went out of his face entirely, and what was left was the bare, cold thing underneath, the thing that had been there all along beneath the reasonable voice. "You are either a very honest man, Corporal," he said softly, "or a very foolish one. In my experience they are usually the same man, and he usually ends the same way." He drew the paper back across the desk and set it neatly aside as though it no longer mattered, and perhaps to him it no longer did. "Very well. You have refused the kind path. You will take the other one. As controller of the household with authority over the standing guard, I relieve you of your duties as of this moment. You will surrender your post. You will remove yourself from the active roles of the foot pending an inquiry into the assault of a peer of the realm, an inquiry I shall convene, and over which my cousin, who has some experience of such matters from the Exchequer bench, may well preside. You will not approach the royal family. You will not approach any member of the household above your former station. You will hold yourself ready to answer charges. Do you understand?" "I understand, sir," I said. "Your coat," he said. "It is a small thing, the surrender of a coat. It is also the largest thing in the world, when it is the coat you have worn for 19 years and earned every thread of, the red wool that means you are one of the few the realm trusts to stand at its children's backs." I had told the captain I would hand it over with my back straight, and I did. I unbuttoned the brass buttons one by one, slowly, with hands that I would not let shake, and I took off the coat of the household foot, and I folded it the way we are taught to fold it, with the stag turned outward and the collar squared, and I laid it on the corner of the polished desk in front of Lord Erskine Vaught, and I stood before him in my shirt in the warm, rich room, and I felt the cold of it go all the way through me though the fire was burning. "You may go," he said, and had already taken up his pen again. I went. I will not pretend the walk down that cold stair was easy. It was the hardest walk of my life, harder than crossing the hall to take Dunhallow's wrist, because in the hall the work was clear, and in that moment there was nothing to be done but bear it. I had done everything right. I had saved the boy and stopped the man and used the least force that would serve, and told the truth and refused the lie. And for all of it I was walking out of the palace in my shirt sleeves with my coat folded on a powerful man's desk, and the powerful man had already forgotten me, and his brother-in-law would walk free with an apology, and the truth would be called a misunderstanding. And that was how the world worked, was it not? That was how it had always worked. The strong arranging things to their comfort, and the honest man ground to powder for refusing to help them do it. That was the bottom of it. I want to give it to you honestly, because the turn means nothing if you do not first stand at the bottom with me. I crossed the cold courtyard in my shirt sleeves in the gray morning, the courtyard I had guarded for 19 years, past the very gate where old Kale had told me who the post was for, and I thought that perhaps old Kale had been wrong, or worse, that he had been right and it had never mattered, that the wall could always be moved if the man pushing had a controller in the family. I thought of my mother in the hill country and what I would tell her. I thought of the boy, and of how I had promised him he was safe, and of how I had not been able to keep myself safe at all. I reached the great outer gate, where 2 guardsmen of the foot stood their posts, men I knew, Harrick and Donnell, and they looked at me crossing toward them in my shirt sleeves, and they understood at once what it meant, and I saw the shock and the anger come into their faces, and Harrick opened his mouth to speak. And then the bells began to ring. Not the slow bells of the hours. The other bells, the deep, fast, urgent bells of the inner keep, the bells that in 19 years I had heard rung in earnest only twice, the bells that mean the household to arms, every guard to his station, the family in some danger. They crashed out across the cold morning, and the 2 guardsmen at the gate snapped from their shock to their training in an instant, and somewhere behind me in the palace I heard shouting and the slam of doors and the run of many boots, and I stood frozen in the courtyard in my shirt sleeves, no longer a guard, no longer permitted to so much as approach the family, while every bell in Harrowgate Palace screamed that something had gone terribly wrong. Harrick at the gate caught a runner who came pelting across the courtyard, gripped him by the shoulder. "What is it? Where?" The runner was a kitchen boy, white-faced, gasping. "The Lord, the one from last night, they let him go. They let him out this morning with an apology like they said, and he didn't leave. He went up, he's gone up into the east wing where the young ones do their lessons. He's got the prince. They're saying he's got the young prince." The world went very still and very loud at once. I understood it whole in an instant, the way I had understood Vaught's game whole, the way the work teaches you to understand a thing before you have time to feel it. Lord Casimir Dunhallow had been released with an apology, exactly as his brother-in-law had arranged, before the Queen could rule otherwise, the whole night tidied away. But a man like Casimir Dunhallow does not take a release as the mercy it is and go quietly home. A man like that takes it as proof that he was right all along, that men like him cannot truly be touched, that the night before had been an aberration, an insult, a thing that demanded an answer. He had been humiliated before the whole court by a boy and a guard. The guard was gone, dismissed, no longer a danger to him. He would have heard that too, the household talks. And so he had not gone home. He had gone up into the east wing, where he had perhaps learned the young prince took his morning lessons, to have his answer, to frighten the boy who had shamed him, to prove to himself that he was a man no one stopped, drunk perhaps still on last night's wine, and this morning's bitter triumph, and the dangerous certainty of a small man who has just been told he cannot be punished. I did not decide to run. I want that understood, for what came next was against every order I had just been given. I had been told not to approach the family, told I was no longer a guard, told to hold myself ready to answer charges, and a man weighing it in his mind would have weighed all of that and perhaps stayed frozen at the gate. But I did not weigh it. The same thing that had crossed the hall the night before, the thing that lives below thought and below order and below even the fear of ruin, the thing old Kale had named when he said, "You stand here so the powerful cannot do as they please with the powerless." That thing moved me, and I was already running across the courtyard toward the east wing before the kitchen boy had finished his sentence. "Vale," Harrick shouted behind me. "You're relieved you can't." "Then arrest me after," I called back, and I did not slow. I knew the east wing as I knew my own hands. 19 years a guard of that house. There was not a corridor of it I had not walked 1,000 times in the dark, not a door I did not know the swing of, not a stair I could not have climbed blind. The schoolroom where the royal children took their morning lessons was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a long gallery, a bright south-facing room with tall windows, and I went up the servants' stair 3 steps at a time because it was faster, and because it came out nearest to the gallery, and I came out into the gallery running and saw, at the far end, the thing the bells had been screaming about. The schoolroom door stood open. The old tutor, Master Pelham, was on the floor of the gallery just outside it, not badly hurt I thought, but down, his spectacles broken beside him, a hand pressed to his head where he had struck the door frame or been struck. He had tried to stop the man and had been thrown aside. And through the open door I could see into the bright schoolroom, and I could see Lord Casimir Dunhallow, his purple velvet rumpled and stained with the night, his face the bloodless white of his worst rage, standing in the middle of the room. And I could see Prince Joran. The boy had put himself between the man and the corner of the room, and in that corner, small and frozen and clutching a slate to her chest, was the little Princess Malin, 8 years old, who took her lessons with her brother in the mornings, and whom the boy was now standing in front of with his arms spread wide and his small chin up, exactly as he had refused to flinch the night before, putting his own body between his little sister and the furious man. "You think you can shame me," Lord Casimir was saying, low and shaking, advancing a step. "You and your painted soldier. You think you can correct me, lecture me in front of the whole court. Well, your soldier's gone, boy, gone this morning. There's no one here now but you and me, and I'm going to teach you the lesson he stopped me teaching you last night." "You won't touch my sister," the prince said. His voice shook and held as it had held the night before. "You can do what you want to me, but you won't touch her. I have stood in stillness for 19 years, and I have seen brave things done by grown men under fire, and I tell you that I had never seen anything braver than that boy spreading his arms in front of his little sister before a man 4 times his size, offering himself in her place. It went through me like a blade, and it also told me, in the cold, clear part of the mind that the work keeps separate from the heart, exactly what I had to do and exactly how little time I had to do it. I did not shout from the door. A shout would have startled the man, and a startled man with a child within reach is the most dangerous thing there is. He might have lunged, grabbed, done the harm before I could close the distance. So I did not announce myself. I came down that gallery fast and silent, the way the work teaches you to move when stealth serves better than noise, past the fallen tutor, through the open door, and I was halfway across the bright schoolroom before Lord Casimir Dunhallow knew I was there at all. He heard me at the last instant and began to turn, his face going from rage to disbelief. For he had been told the soldier was gone, dismissed, no danger, and his disbelief at seeing me, shirt-sleeved and impossible, bought me the half-second I needed. He was reaching for the boy as he turned, his hand already out, and I did the thing I had done the night before, the only thing, the thing 19 years had made certain in me. I took the wrist. Not the night before's careful banquet table hold. This was the same principle and a harder edge, because this was not a feast, and there was no court watching, and there was a frightened child of 8 in the corner and a brave one of 10 in the way, and the man was on his feet and unbalanced, and had already shown he would lay hands on children. I caught his outstretched wrist in my bare hand, no glove now, and I turned it, and I stepped through, and I took the strength out of him the way you take the strength out of any man twice your size when you know where his strength lives, and I bore him down, controlled, away from the children, down to his knees on the schoolroom floor with his arm folded up behind him at the exact angle where a man cannot rise and cannot strike and cannot do anything at all but be still. He cried out, not in true pain. I had given him, again, the mercy of the threshold, the hold that masters without breaking, but in the shock of a man who has spent his whole life unstopped and has now been stopped twice by the same wall he believed he had removed. He bucked once against the hold and found there was nothing in it for him, no give, no leverage, only the quiet iron of a thing done exactly right, and then he went still, kneeling, his cheek near the cold floorboards, breathing hard. "Don't move," I said, low, level, the same voice as the night before. "It is over, Lord Dunhallow, it was over last night, you only made it worse." And then I looked up, past the kneeling man to the children. Prince Joran had not moved from in front of his sister. His arms were still spread, his chin still up, and he was staring at me at the dismissed guard in his shirt sleeves who had appeared out of nowhere and put the monster on the floor, with an expression I will carry to my grave, a child's whole heart breaking open with relief, and he said in a voice that finally cracked, "You came back. They said you were gone. You came back." "I will always come back, Your Highness," I said. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head. And then, because he was 10 and had been braver than any child should ever have to be, he turned and gathered his little sister into his arms, the slate clattering forgotten to the floor, and the two of them held each other in the corner of the bright schoolroom, and the little princess began at last to cry, the safe crying of a child who has been frightened and is frightened no longer, and the prince held her and stroked her hair the way I think he had seen his mother do. And over her head, he looked at me kneeling on the man who would have harmed them, and there was no fear left in his face at all. It was at that moment, of course it was at that moment, for the world has a sense of these things, that the running boots in the corridors finally arrived, and the doorway of the schoolroom filled with men. Guards of the foot, half a dozen of them with the captain at their head. The queen herself, who had run, the Queen of Eldermoor with her skirts caught up in her hands and her hair half down, a mother before she was a sovereign, the prince consort behind her. And among them, breathless, having come up with the household at the alarm, the cold, pale figure of Lord Erskine Vaught, the controller, who had relieved me of my coat not 20 minutes before, and who now stood in the doorway and saw his brother-in-law kneeling on the schoolroom floor with his arm folded up behind him in the grip of the very guard he had just dismissed. For a long moment no one spoke. The only sounds in the bright room were the little princess's fading sobs and Lord Casimir's hard breathing, and somewhere outside, the bells still ringing, until the captain barked an order down the corridor and they fell silent one by one. The queen crossed the room. She did not go first to me, nor to the kneeling man, nor to Lord Vaught. She went to her children, and she dropped to her knees on the schoolroom floor in her feast-day gown and gathered them both into her arms, the prince and the princess, and held them, and I saw her shoulders shake once and then go still as she mastered herself, for a queen may be a mother for a moment but cannot stay only a mother for long. When she rose, her face had changed. The warmth that is her nature had gone somewhere deep, and a cold I had never seen had come up over it. "Tell me," she said to the room, to anyone, in a voice like the edge of ice on a winter pond, "what has happened here?" Was the captain who answered, for he had read the room as he read every room, taken in the kneeling lord and the shirt-sleeved guard and the weeping children, and assembled the truth of it faster than any of the great folk could. "Majesty, Lord Dunhallow was released this morning and did not leave the grounds. He came up to the schoolroom and forced the door, struck Master Pelham aside and laid hold or made to lay hold of their highnesses. Corporal Vale stopped him. A small pause, very deliberate. Again. "Corporal Vale," the queen said, and turned to me, and saw for the first time fully that I knelt there on the man in my shirt with no coat. Her eyes went from my bare shoulders to the folded thing the absence of the coat meant, and then they moved slowly, terribly, to Lord Erskine Vaught in the doorway. "Corporal Vale," she said again, without taking her eyes from the controller, "why are you not in your coat?" The silence then was a different silence. Lord Vaught, who had perhaps in 19 years never once been at a loss, was at a loss now. He opened his mouth. "I relieved him of his duties this morning, Majesty," he said, and to his credit he did not lie about it, perhaps because the lie was too large to attempt with the proof of his error kneeling on the floor. "On my authority as controller. The matter of last night, the assault upon my brother-in-law, I judged it prudent to—" "You judged it prudent," the queen said, "to take the coat off the one man in this palace who had stood between my son and harm, and to release the man who had laid hands on him." She let it hang. "And while you were judging it prudent, Lord Vaught, the man you released walked up into my children's schoolroom to do to both of them what your own brother-in-law had begun. And the only reason I am holding my children in my arms this morning instead of—" her voice did not break, but it stopped, for a breath, on the thing too terrible to say, and the whole room felt the unsayable thing pass through it. "The only reason," she went on, "is that the man you dismissed 20 minutes ago refused to stay dismissed, that he ran toward the bells when he had every reason and every order to run away from them, that he is, it would seem, a better servant of this house stripped of his coat than half my council are in their chains of office." Lord Erskine Vaught had gone the color of the schoolroom plaster. "Majesty, I could not have known." "You did not wish to know," the Queen said. "There is a difference, and I have spent the morning learning it. You wished the night tidied away because the man at the center of it shared your wife's blood, and so you weighed the comfort of your family against the truth, and you chose your family, and you very nearly chose my children's lives along with it. Do not speak to me of what you could not have known. A child of 10 knew better than you. He asked Lord Dunhallow to be gentle. That was all the knowing it required." She turned from him then, as though he were no longer worth the turning of her head. And that, I think, wounded Lord Erskine Vaught more than any sentence could have, to be simply turned away from by his queen in front of the whole household. And I understood that I had just watched a controller of the household lose everything that mattered to a man of his kind, which is not his office, not yet, but the regard that gives the office its weight. "Captain," the Queen said. "Majesty, take Lord Casimir Dunhallow into custody. Properly this time, and he is not to be released on the word of any member of my council, including the controller, including any office whatsoever, save my own word and mine alone. He will answer to the law for laying hands upon both of my children, and there will be no apology offered, and no misunderstanding entered into any record, and no quiet path. The realm will hear exactly what he did. Do you understand me?" "Perfectly, Majesty," the captain said, and there was something in his flat gray voice that in any other man I would have called satisfaction. The guards came forward and took Lord Casimir from me, and I gave him up gladly, my hand aching now from the holding, and I rose at last to my feet in the bright room, shirt-sleeved and emptied out, and stood as I have always stood, while they lifted the man and bound his hands and led him toward the door. He went past Lord Vaught, his brother-in-law, his protector, and he looked at him for help, and Lord Vaught looked away, because there are friends a man has only as long as he is useful, and a Dunhallow bound for the law was useful to no one. That, too, the kneeling man learned that morning. He was led out, and the bells finally stopped, and the bright schoolroom held its breath for what the Queen would do next. What she did next was turn to me. "Corporal Vale," she said, and the cold had gone out of her voice now, and the warmth that is her nature had come back into it, and something more than warmth, something that made me stand even straighter than the work requires. "Last night you stopped a man from harming my son at my own table, and you did it with such discipline that the whole court remarked upon it, that you used not 1 grain more force than the moment required, and released the man the instant the prince was free. This morning you ran toward danger with no coat on your back, and no order to obey, and every reason to walk away, and you stopped that same man from harming both of my children. And again, you did it with a restraint that any soldier in my realm might study for a lifetime and not master. You were dismissed from my service this morning. I tell you now, before my children and my household and every soul in this room, that the dismissal was a grievous error, made over my head and against my will, by a man who placed his family above his queen. It is undone, wholly undone. Your name is restored to the rolls of the foot, and it will be entered this very day that you acted in both instances with perfect honor, and that the realm owes you a debt it cannot easily repay." I could not speak. I have stood through a great deal and shown nothing, but I will tell you that I had to set my jaw very hard indeed to keep my face to its stone in that bright room, with the Queen of Eldermoor speaking those words, and the 2 children she had borne looking at me from the circle of her arm. "There is the matter of your coat," the Queen went on. "Captain, where is Corporal Vale's coat?" "On the desk of the controller, Majesty," the captain said, with great evenness, "where Lord Vaught required him to leave it." "Then Lord Vaught will fetch it," the Queen said. The room went very still. It is not a thing that is done, that a controller of the household, a lord of the Privy Council, should be sent to fetch a corporal's coat like a page. It was, I understood, precisely the point. The Queen was not going to dismiss Lord Erskine Vaught from his offices in that schoolroom. That would come in its time through the proper forms, and it did come, though that is a longer story. What she was going to do, here, now, in front of everyone, was something harder for a man like Vaught to bear than dismissal. She was going to make him, with his own hands, undo the thing he had done. To carry back the coat he had stripped from an honest man, and to give it to him, and to be seen doing it. "Majesty," Lord Vaught said very low, "I surely a servant." "You took it," the Queen said. "You will return it. A man should clean up his own spills, Lord Vaught, even a small one. I am told there was some difficulty about that very principle at my table last night. And the thrust of it, that the whole catastrophe had begun with a great man's refusal to forgive a servant a spilled dish, and would end with a great man made to fetch and carry himself, was not lost on a single soul in the room, and Lord Erskine Vaught heard it, and his face told me that he would hear it for the rest of his life. He went. We waited in the bright schoolroom, the Queen with her children, the captain by the door, the guards at their stations, and the old tutor Master Pelham sitting up now against the wall with a cloth pressed to his head, refusing to be carried out until he had seen the end of it. And after a while Lord Vaught returned, and he carried in his own 2 hands the red coat of the household foot, folded as I had folded it, the stag turned outward, and he crossed the room to me, and he held it out, and I took it from him. I will say this for Erskine Vaught, who was not a good man. He met my eyes when he gave it to me. He did not have to. He could have looked at the floor. But he met my eyes, and there was in his cold, clever face something that was not quite an apology, for men like him do not apologize, but was the next thing to it, the bare acknowledgment of a man who has been shown, beyond any possibility of denial, that he was wrong. "Corporal," he said, "only that." And I said, "My lord, only that," and took my coat. I put it on there in the schoolroom, in front of them all. I will not pretend my hands were entirely steady at the buttons. 19 years I had worn that coat, and I had taken it off an hour before believing I would never wear it again. And now I buttoned it back over my heart, one brass button at a time, the red wool settling onto my shoulders like the return of my own self. And when the last button was done, I came to attention, and I was a guard of the household foot again, and the relief of it was so large that it frightened me. It was the little princess who broke the solemn quiet. She had stopped crying, and she had been watching all of it from the circle of her mother's arm with her great wet eyes, and now she wriggled free and crossed the room to me, 8 years old, and she stopped in front of me and tipped her head all the way back to look up at the tall man in red, and she said, in the clear high voice of a child, "Are you the one who held the bad man so he couldn't hurt us?" "I am, your highness," I said. She considered this with great seriousness. And then she held up the slate she had been clutching to her chest through the whole terror of it, the slate she had not let go of even when she wept. And on it, in a child's careful chalk, was a drawing, a tall figure in a red coat and a black hat, standing very straight, and beside him 2 small figures, a boy and a girl, and around the 3 of them a wobbly chalk line that I understood after a moment was meant to be a wall. "I drew it this morning," she said, "before it's you. You're the wall that keeps us safe." And she held the slate up higher, so I could see it properly, this small grave gift, and I looked at it. And for the second time that morning, I had to set my jaw very hard to keep my face to its stone, because she could not have known she was 8. She could not possibly have known what old Cale had said to me on a winter gate 17 years before about the wall, and what it had meant to me all the cold morning to fear that the wall could be moved after all. And here was a child of 8 telling me, with a piece of chalk, that it could not. "May I keep this drawing, your highness?" I asked her. "I have never been given anything I would rather have." She nodded, pleased and shy, and pressed the slate into my hands, and I have it still. It hangs in my quarters where I can see it from my bed, a tall red figure and two small ones and a wobbly chalk wall. And on the bad nights, the nights the work is hard and the world seems arranged for the comfort of the cruel, I look at it, and it is enough. The rest of the morning, and the days that followed, belong to the part of the story that is not mine to have lived directly. The part that happened in council chambers and courtrooms I never entered, and that came to me as such things come to a guard, in fragments and in the careful talk of the household. But I will give it to you whole, because you have come this far and you deserve to know how the scales came at last to balance. Lord Casimir Dunhallow was tried. Not quietly, not with the discretion his brother-in-law had begged for, but openly before the High Court of the realm, on the charge of laying violent hands upon both heirs of the crown. His cousin of the Exchequer bench, who he had boasted would protect him, did not preside. The Queen saw to that, and saw too that the judges who did preside were men no Dunhallow had ever done a favor for. The considerable resources of the family proved a good deal less considerable than Lord Casimir had imagined, for resources are friends, and friends melt from a man whose name has become a thing one does not wish to be associated with. He stood in the dock alone. The footman Tomas testified, the river country boy who had trembled at the great occasion, and he did not tremble in the witness box. He told plainly how the Lord had struck him over a drop of sauce, and the court listened, and something shifted in the realm that day that was larger than one trial, for it is not every day that a court of great folk stops to hear a footman and believes him over a lord. I testified too. I told it exactly as I have told it to you, the spill, the shove, the prince's plea, the seizing of the arm, the wrist taken and released, the threats, and then the schoolroom, the released man gone up to the children, the second stopping. The defense lawyer, a clever man earning his fee, tried to make of me what Lord Vaught had tried to make, a guard who had overreacted, misread a gesture, manhandled a peer of the realm. He asked me, sneering a little, whether it was not true that I had laid violent hands on a lord of the Westmark on no more than a guess about his intentions. And I said, I laid one gloved hand upon his wrist, sir, and I released it the moment the prince was free, and I never struck him at all either night. If that is violence, then I will own to it, and gladly, for it is the only violence that stands between a child and the man who would harm him. But I would ask the court to mark the difference between the hand that seizes a boy and the hand that stops it. They are not the same hand. They have never been the same hand, and a realm that cannot tell them apart is a realm I would not wish to live in. I am told it was quiet in the courtroom after that. I am told the Queen, who sat through the whole of the trial though she need not have, gave the smallest nod when I said it. The court could tell the hands apart. Lord Casimir Dunhallow was found guilty on both charges, stripped of the courtesies of his rank for the duration of a long confinement, and removed from the society he had so prized. And the prizing of it, in the end, was the cruelest part of his punishment, for a man whose whole self was his importance lost the only thing he had ever truly owned. The last I heard of him, he was an old man in a small house in the Westmark, unvisited, his name a thing his own family had learned not to say. The world had taught him, at last and far too late, the lesson a child of 10 had tried to teach him for free at a banquet table, that the powerful are not permitted their cruelties, that the wall is real, and that the gentlest path was always the one he refused. As for Lord Erskine Vaught, he was not tried, for he had broken no law, only his trust. But the Queen does not forget, and a controller who has been shown to weigh his family above his sovereign and very nearly above her children's lives, is a controller whose days are numbered, however correct the forms of his going. Within the season he had resigned his offices, for reasons of health, which is the phrase a great man uses when he has been quietly told that he must go. He kept his title and his lands and his liberty, which is more than his brother-in-law kept. But he left the palace, and the regard of his queen left with him, and I do not think he ever forgave himself the morning he had to carry a corporal's coat across a schoolroom, not out of guilt, for I do not believe he had much of that, but because it was the morning he learned that his cleverness, the thing he had trusted his whole life, had failed him utterly when it mattered, beaten by a farrier's son who simply would not sign a lie. There was a moment in that trial I have not yet told you, and I will tell it now, because it is the moment I think of most when I think of the whole long business, and because it shows you something about restraint that the rest of the story only points toward. It came near the end, after the verdict had been given and before the sentence was pronounced, when the court asked, as the old forms require, whether any present wished to speak to the character of the condemned, for or against. There was a long silence. Lord Casimir's friends, what few he had left, were not there. They had melted away as friends do. And into that silence the Queen, who had sat through the whole trial in plain dark clothes like any other witness, rose and asked leave to speak, and was of course granted it. I expected her to be terrible. I expected her to lay out the whole of his cruelty, the servant struck, the children seized, the lie his brother-in-law had tried to build, the morning her household had nearly lost everything that mattered. She had every right to. The court would have hung on her every word. She did not. What she said was short and quiet, and I have never forgotten it. "I will not speak against this man," the Queen said. "He has spoken against himself more eloquently than I ever could in this courtroom and at my table, and the court has heard him. I will say only this. The whole of his ruin began with a single drop of sauce on a velvet sleeve, and a small choice, the smallest choice in the world, to answer a servant's honest mistake with cruelty instead of grace. He could have smiled. He could have waved it away. It would have cost him nothing, and he would have gone home that night an ordinary man and slept in his own bed, and none of us would ever have known his name. Instead, he chose cruelty, because it was easy and he was used to it, and every cruelty after that one followed from it as night follows dusk. I ask the court to remember when it judges him that he was not undone by his enemies. He was undone by himself, one ungentle choice at a time. And I ask every great person in this realm who hears of this day to remember the same, and to look to their own small choices, for that is where a life is decided. Not in the grand moments, which are rare, but in the drop of sauce on the sleeve, which comes to all of us every day and asks us quietly who we are. She sat down. The courtroom was silent a long while, and I understood, listening, that the Queen had just done with words exactly what I had done with a held wrist, used the least force that would serve and not one grain more, and in the restraint of it found a power that no shouting could have matched. She had not needed to crush him. She had only needed to be true and to let his own choices be the weight that fell on him. That is the highest form of the thing I have spent my life learning, and I learned it again, that day, from a queen in plain dark clothes, and I have tried to be worthy of the lesson ever since. Those are the great consequences, the ones that played out in courts and councils. But it is the small ones I treasure, and it is the small ones, I have come to think, that are the truer measure of what changed in Harrowgate that spring. The footman Tomas, the trembling river country boy who spilled sauce had set the whole avalanche in motion, did not lose his place, as he had been certain he would. The opposite. The Queen, who walks her own kitchens, heard the whole of his part in it, and she had him brought before her, and she told him that he had served her better than half her court by telling the truth in a witness box when it would have been easier to stay small and silent, and she raised him from footman to a place of trust in the household, and he serves there yet, a steady man now, no longer trembling. I see him often. He nods to me when we pass, and I nod to him, two men from the bottom of the glass who held to the truth and were not broken by it, and there is a whole conversation in that nod that neither of us has ever needed to say aloud. Master Pelham, the old tutor, recovered from the blow to his head, and was, if anything, prouder of the bruise than ashamed of being thrown aside, for he had tried, old and frail as he was, to put himself between a furious man and his pupils, and he counted it the finest thing he had done in 50 years of teaching. He retired the year after, full of honors, and at his farewell the prince, older than 11, taller, gave a small speech about him that made the old man weep. And the prince had learned, I noticed, to give such a speech without once making it about himself, which is a thing they do not teach princes, and which he had taught himself, and I knew where he had learned it. For the boy was changed by that spring, and changed for the better, in the way that hard things sometimes change the young if there is someone steady near them while the hard thing happens. Prince Joran had always had his mother's quick heart. After that spring he had something more, a gravity, a steadiness, a way of carrying himself that the younger children of the court began, without quite knowing why, to look to. He had stood twice between cruelty and the helpless, once for a servant and once for his sister, and he had been frightened both times and had done it anyway. And a boy who learns that young that he can be afraid and brave at once is a boy who will be a king worth following. I watched him grow, year on year, from my post behind his chair and at his door, and I will tell you that the realm need not fear for its future while that boy is in it. He came to me, perhaps a month after that spring, in one of the rare quiet hours, and he asked if I would teach him. Not the whole of the work, a prince cannot be a guardsman and his path is a different one, but the principle of it. The wrist, he said, how a small thing held in the right place can master a large one. And more than that, and this is the part that told me what kind of man he would be, he said. And how to know when to let go. You said that was the hard part. I want to learn the hard part. So I taught him in the quiet hours with the Queen's leave, not to fight but to understand. That strength governed is the only strength worth having. That the man who can do harm and chooses the least harm that will serve is stronger than the man who knows no measure. That the whole of honor lives in the gap between what you could do and what you choose to do. He learned it well. He learned it, I think, better than I have ever taught it, because he had felt it from both sides, the boy seized and the boy who refused to flinch. And a lesson felt in the body is learned in a way no words can match. I have wondered sometimes whether the worst night of that boy's young life was also, strangely, the making of him. I do not say it was worth it. A child should never have to be seized to learn courage, and I would have spared him every moment of the fear if I could. But the world does not ask us what it should hand our children. It only asks what we will do when it has handed them something terrible, and whether we will stand beside them while they bear it. I stood beside him. That was all I had to give, and it turned out to be enough. There is one more thing I would tell you before I let you go, and it is the thing I have circled this whole long account to reach, the thing I most want a listener to carry away. A season after the trial, the Queen held the Feast of the Long Accord again, as the realm holds it every year, in the same great state hall under the same painted ceiling, where the founders ride forever across their sky of gold. The same iron trees of candles, the same long white cloth. And I stood my post behind the prince's chair, as I have stood it now for these many years since, in my red coat with its brass buttons all in their places, and I watched the hall fill with the great folk of the realm, and I marked, as I always mark, which had drunk too deep, and which had come already grieving, and which carried some private wrong I could read in the set of a shoulder. But the hall was different that night, and I felt the difference, and I have felt it at every feast since. The great folk looked at me, not all of them and not for long, and most of them did not know they did it, but there was a thing in the room that had not been there before the spring, a knowing. They had heard the story, all of them, the realm had heard it. They knew that the tall silent figures in red along the walls were not furniture, not clowns in fur hats, not statues that could be flicked and mocked and looked through. They knew that a man stood inside the coat. They knew that he saw them. And they knew, this above all, that if one of them, however highly born, however powerful, however certain of his own importance, should reach out a hand to do harm to the helpless at that table, that hand would be stopped, and stopped with a discipline they could not match and could not buy and could not order away, and that no brother-in-law on any council in the realm would save them from the wall. That is what changed. Not the law, though the law changed too. Not the punishment of one cruel lord, though that mattered. What changed was the knowing, the certainty, settled now into the bones of the court, that the powerful are not, after all, permitted to do as they please with the powerless under that gold-leaf sky. It is a small thing, and it is the whole thing. It is the reason the post exists. Old Kale told me on a winter gate that I stood there so the powerful could not do as they pleased with the powerless, and for 17 years I believed him without ever quite knowing whether it was true, whether one still man in a red coat could really be such a wall against all the weight of rank and money and clever men with cold eyes. Now I know it is true. I watched it become true. It cost me a coat for an hour and very nearly cost me everything, and I would pay it again tonight without a breath of hesitation, because I have seen what it buys. People ask me, sometimes, the young guardsmen mostly, the ones still half frozen on the winter gates and certain they have thrown their lives away, they ask me how I bore it. The 19 years of standing still, the being looked through, the not reacting while a wrong is done a yard from your face, and most of all they ask how I bore that morning, the coat stripped from my back, the lie laid before me on a polished desk, the certainty that doing everything right had ended in everything lost. How did you not sign it, they ask. How did you walk out in your shirt and not break? And I tell them what I have told you, that the strength is not in the standing, the legs learn the standing. The strength is in the restraint, in feeling the whole storm and giving the world only what the world has a right to. I felt the rage when he seized the boy, and I did not let it rule me, and I gave that man a held wrist instead of a broken arm, and that restraint was the strongest thing I did. I felt the fear when they took my coat, and I did not let it rule me, and I gave that clever cold man a refusal instead of a signature, and that restraint was stronger still. For there are two kinds of restraint a guard must learn, and the second is harder than the first. The first is to hold your hand when your blood says strike. The second is to hold your honor when the whole weight of the world says bend, to stand straight in your shirt sleeves and refuse the easy lie, knowing it may cost you everything, because some things must not be signed away no matter the price, and a man who will sell his honor to keep his place has already lost the only thing that made the place worth keeping. That is the whole of what I know, after all these years. The arrogant look at the still man and see weakness, and they are wrong, and the measure of how wrong they are is the measure of what falls on them when the stillness finally moves. Lord Casimir Dunhallow looked at me across a banquet table and saw a painted clown, a thing trained to bark, a fixture he could ignore while he laid his hand on a child. He could not have been more mistaken about anything in his life. What he was looking at was a banked fire, and a held wrist and 19 years of learning exactly how much to let out. And the night he mistook all of that for weakness was the night the whole arrangement of his certain world came down on him, slowly, completely, and forever. I stand my post still. The boy is a young man now, and the little princess with her chalk slate is a young woman, and the queen's hair has gone from dark to gray and lost none of its iron, and I am no longer young myself. My legs ache now in the cold the way old Kale's must have ached, and there will come a year not far off, when a younger man takes my place behind the prince's chair, and I will teach him, as the captain taught me, the things the drill manual cannot hold. I will tell him that he is not furniture. I will tell him whom the post is for. I will tell him that he will feel everything and master it, or he is no use to anyone. And I will tell him last and most, the thing the slate on my wall has told me every night since a child of 8 pressed it into my hands, that he is the wall, that the wall is real, that the powerful do not get to do as they please while he is standing there, and that no man, however great, however certain, however sure that no one would dare, will ever lay a hand on a child at that table while a guard of the household foot draws breath behind the chair. That is the post. That is the whole of it, and I would not have traded one cold hour of it for any easier life the world could offer, because I have stood between cruelty and a child and held, and a man who has done that even once has done the thing he was made for, and can stand his stillness to the end of his days in peace.